Hey guys, tonight we're going back to a time when creating a single book could take an entire lifetime. Not because the technology was complicated, but because every single letter, every curve of every word had to be drawn by hand. We're talking about medieval monks in their scriptoriums, the quiet rooms where they spent decades copying manuscripts, one careful stroke at a time. This isn't a story about adventure or conquest. This is about patience. This is about the profound, almost hypnotic repetition that preserved human knowledge through the darkest centuries of European history. Picture yourself in the year 1150, somewhere in northern France. You wake before dawn in a cold stone monastery. The bells ring for matins, the first prayer service of the day, and you shuffle with your fellow monks into the chapel. Your breath makes clouds in the frigid air. After prayers, there's a simple breakfast. Perhaps some bread, watered wine, and if you're lucky, a piece of cheese. Then you walk to the scriptorium. The scriptorium is a long room with high windows designed to let in maximum daylight. There are no artificial lights beyond candles, and candles are expensive, reserved only for the darkest winter afternoons. The room is unheated because heat and humidity can damage parchment and cause ink to run. So you sit at your wooden desk, wrapped in whatever layers of wool the monastery can provide, and you begin your day's work. Your task is simple in concept but staggering in execution. You are copying a manuscript of the Bible. Specifically, you're working on the Book of Psalms. You've been working on this same book for 3 years now. You expect it will take you at least 2 more years to finish, and when you're done, you'll likely start on another book and another, until your eyes fail or your hands can no longer hold the quill. The process begins with the parchment itself. Parchment is made from animal skin, usually sheep, goat, or calf. The skins must be soaked, scraped, stretched, and treated with lime to create a smooth, pale surface suitable for writing. A single Bible might require the skins of 300 sheep. The monastery has a dedicated workshop for parchment preparation, and the smell of lime and flesh is something you never quite get used to, even after years. Once the parchment is prepared and cut into sheets, it comes to you. Each sheet must be carefully ruled with a lead point or a sharp stylus, creating faint horizontal lines to guide your writing. You use a straight edge, measuring carefully to ensure the lines are evenly spaced. This ruling process alone can take hours for a single page. Some scriptoriums have junior monks or novices who specialize in ruling pages, but in smaller monasteries you do it yourself. Then comes the actual copying. You sit before your exemplar, the book you're copying from. It might be 100 years old or even older. It might be a copy of a copy of a copy, going back through generations. Your job is not to understand what you're copying necessarily. Many monks copying Latin texts couldn't actually read Latin with full comprehension. Your job is simply to reproduce, with perfect fidelity, every letter exactly as it appears in the exemplar. You dip your quill, a goose feather, carefully cut and shaped, into your inkwell. The ink is made from oak galls, iron salts, and gum arabic, mixed to a precise consistency. Too thin and it will run on the parchment. Too thick and it won't flow from your quill. You've learned through years of practice exactly how the ink should feel, how it should sit on the tip of your quill before you touch it to parchment. The first letter you write today is a capital B at the beginning of a new psalm. This is no ordinary letter. Capital letters at the beginnings of verses or chapters are illuminated, decorated with gold leaf, brilliant pigments, and intricate designs. You're not skilled enough yet to do illumination work yourself. That's reserved for the senior monks, the ones whose hands have achieved such steadiness that they can paint details finer than a hair's width. But you leave space for the illuminator, drawing a faint mark where the B will eventually go. Then you begin the body text. Beatus vir qui non habit in concilio impiorum. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked. You know this psalm by heart now. You've copied it before in other manuscripts, but familiarity breeds not speed but rather caution. Every time you copy a familiar passage, you're more likely to write from memory rather than from your exemplar. And memory is treacherous. Memory makes mistakes, so you force yourself to look at each word in the exemplar, copy it letter by letter, then look again. Your hand moves in careful, practiced motions. The scratch of the quill on parchment is the dominant sound in the scriptorium, joined by the scratching of a dozen other quills around you. No one speaks. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governs your monastery's life, emphasizes silence. Speech is permitted only when necessary, and copying manuscripts is not a time when speech is necessary. If you need something, more ink, a fresh quill, a different exemplar, you have a system of hand signals. A finger pointed to your eye means you need better light. A hand held flat, palm down, means you need your exemplar adjusted. Hours pass. The light shifts across the room as the sun moves. Your back begins to ache from hunching over your desk. Your fingers cramp around the quill. Your eyes strain to see the faint letters in the exemplar, especially if it's an old manuscript where the ink has faded to brown. But you continue. You're not working toward a deadline in the modern sense. There's no publisher waiting, no release date to meet. You're working toward perfection, toward the preservation of God's Word in its exact and complete form. By midday, you've completed perhaps half a page. That's a good day's work for body text. If you were doing illuminated capitals or detailed marginalia, you might spend an entire day on a single large letter. The bell rings for sext, the midday prayer, and you carefully clean your quill, stopper your ink, and mark your place in both your exemplar and your working page. You file out with the other monks to pray. After prayers and a simple meal, perhaps vegetable soup, bread, and an apple, you return to the scriptorium. The afternoon light is best for copying, coming in strong through the southern windows. You settle back into your work, finding the place you left off. Et in lege eius meditabitur diac nocte, and on his law he meditates day and night. The irony is not lost on you, even if you can't articulate it. You are meditating on these words by copying them, slowly, endlessly, day after day, night after night in your memory, even when you're not actively working. The words of the Psalms have become the rhythm of your breathing. The motion of your hand has become a form of prayer, but the work is not without its dangers. The greatest danger is error. If you make a mistake, write the wrong letter, skip a word, transpose two phrases, you create a corrupted text. Future copyists might copy your error, perpetuating it through generations. The responsibility weighs on you, so you develop checking strategies. After completing a line, you read it back against the exemplar. After completing a page, you read the entire page aloud, in a whisper so as not to disturb others, to catch any errors your eye might have missed. When you do find an error, the correction process is delicate. You can't simply cross out and rewrite on parchment. That looks sloppy and unprofessional. Instead, you carefully scrape away the error with a curved knife, gently rubbing the parchment with powdered pumice to smooth it again. Then you rewrite the correct text. If done carefully, the correction is nearly invisible. If done poorly, you leave a thin spot in the parchment that might eventually tear. By evening, you've completed perhaps 3/4 of a page. The light is fading. Your hand is truly cramping now, and you can feel the beginnings of a headache behind your eyes. The bell rings for vespers, evening prayer, and you're relieved to set down your quill. After prayers and a light supper, you have a brief period of recreation, walking in the cloister, talking quietly with other monks, perhaps reading from an approved text. Then Compline, the final prayer of the day, and bed in the dormitory, sleeping on a straw mattress in your woolen habit. And tomorrow you will wake before dawn and do it all again, and the day after that, and the day after that, for years. But here's what's remarkable. You're not alone in this work. Across Europe, in hundreds of monasteries, thousands of monks are doing exactly what you're doing. They're copying Bibles, copying the Church Fathers, copying classical Roman and Greek texts that have survived the fall of Rome. They're creating a web of preserved knowledge, duplicated and distributed across the continent. Without this work, without these decades-long individual copying projects, almost everything we know about the ancient world would have been lost. So the question that lingers as you drift to sleep tonight is this: what makes a person capable of dedicating their entire life to such painstakingly slow, repetitive work? What did these monks understand about patience, about the value of preservation, that we've perhaps forgotten in our age of instant copying and digital reproduction? The answer to that question lies partly in theology, and partly in something more fundamental about human psychology and the medieval understanding of time itself. You see, medieval monks didn't experience time the way we do. They didn't think in terms of efficiency or productivity. They thought in terms of eternity. When you're a 12th century monk copying a manuscript, you're not just creating a book. You're participating in the eternal work of God. Every letter you write is an act of worship, a prayer made visible. The Book of Kells, one of the most famous illuminated manuscripts ever created, contains a page with the word Christ written in such elaborate, intricate detail that it would have taken weeks or even months to complete that single word. To modernize, this seems absurd. Why spend months on one word? But to the monks who created it, every moment spent on that word was a moment spent in contemplation of Christ himself. The work was the prayer. This understanding fundamentally changed the experience of copying. Let's return to you in that scriptorium. Now, several years into your copying of the Psalms, you've developed what we might today call muscle memory, but what you would have understood as a kind of spiritual discipline. Your hand knows the shape of each letter so intimately that you can form them almost without conscious thought. The motion of writing has become a meditation. But this doesn't mean the work has become easy or mindless. In fact, the opposite has happened. As your technical skill has increased, your awareness of the deeper difficulties has also grown. You've become acutely conscious of the ways in which error can creep in, not just through carelessness but through the very nature of copying itself. Consider this problem. You're copying from an exemplar that is itself a copy. That exemplar was copied from another manuscript, which was copied from another, going back perhaps 10 or 15 generations. At each stage of copying, small errors might have been introduced. A tired monk might have skipped a line. An inexperienced scribe might have misread a letter. In medieval handwriting, C and T can look very similar, as can U and N. A distracted copyist might have written a word from memory instead of from the exemplar, accidentally substituting a synonym or a more familiar phrase. Your monastery is aware of this problem. In fact, one of the senior monks, Brother Marcus, serves as a corrector. His job is to check completed pages against the exemplar and against other copies of the same text if available, trying to identify and fix errors. Brother Marcus is elderly now, nearly 70, which is remarkably old for the medieval period. His eyes are weak even by medieval standards, but his knowledge of Scripture is encyclopedic. He can often spot errors not by seeing them, but by knowing that a particular phrase doesn't sound quite right, doesn't match his memory of other versions he's seen. You've watched Brother Marcus work, and it's a fascinating process. He reads your completed pages aloud in a low murmur, following along with the exemplar. When he finds a discrepancy, he pauses. Sometimes he knows immediately which version is correct. Other times he has to consult other manuscripts in the monastery's library. The library isn't large, perhaps 200 volumes, which makes your monastery moderately well stocked by medieval standards. But it includes multiple copies of some biblical books, acquired through gift or trade with other monasteries. When Brother Marcus finds two different versions of the same passage in two different manuscripts, he has to make a judgment call. Which version is correct? Sometimes the choice is obvious. One version makes grammatical sense and the other doesn't. But sometimes both versions seem plausible. In these cases, Brother Marcus has to use his knowledge of theology, his understanding of Latin style, and his sense of what the original author likely intended. He's not just copying. He's engaging in a primitive form of textual criticism, trying to work backward from corrupted copies to divine the original text. This process reveals something crucial about medieval manuscript culture. It was never as static or as blindly repetitive as we sometimes imagine. Every scriptorium was, in its own small way, a site of intellectual work. The monks weren't simply human photocopiers. They were editors, scholars, and preservers of knowledge in an age when knowledge was fragile. Let's look at a specific day in your copying work. About 4 years into your project, you've reached the later Psalms now, moving toward completion. Today you're working on Psalm 119, which is the longest psalm, 176 verses of meditation on the law of God. This psalm has a special structure. It's an acrostic poem in Hebrew, with each section corresponding to a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. In Latin translation, this structure is partially lost, but traces of it remain. As you're copying, you notice something odd. Your exemplar seems to have verses in a slightly different order than you remember from when you chanted this psalm in chapel. You mark the place, and during the next recreation period you mention this quietly to Brother Marcus. He frowns and goes to check. It turns out that your exemplar, which came from a monastery in Italy, represents a slightly different textual tradition than the version used in your monastery's liturgy, which came from France. This leads to a discussion among the senior monks. Should you continue copying from your exemplar, preserving its version faithfully, or should you correct it to match your monastery's liturgical practice? After several days of consideration, nothing happens quickly in medieval monasteries. The decision is made to copy the exemplar exactly as it is, but to add a marginal note explaining the variation. This way, future readers will know that both versions exist and can make their own informed judgments. This decision reflects a sophisticated understanding of textual preservation. The monks aren't trying to create a single correct version and destroy all variants. They're trying to preserve the diversity of the textual tradition, recognizing that variations might themselves contain important information about how the text has been understood and transmitted over time. The physical act of copying, meanwhile, continues with its own rhythms and challenges. Winter is particularly difficult. On the coldest days, the scriptorium is so frigid that ink freezes in its well. You have to warm the ink by holding the inkwell in your hands before you can use it. Your fingers become stiff and clumsy with cold, making it harder to control the quill. Some days, when snow piles against the windows and reduces the light to a dim gray glow, copying becomes nearly impossible. On those days, you might work on other tasks: preparing parchment, mixing ink, repairing damaged books in the library. Spring and summer bring their own challenges. In spring, the parchment can absorb moisture from the humid air, causing it to swell slightly and become harder to write on smoothly. In summer, flies become a problem. A fly landing on wet ink can leave tracks across your page, ruining hours of work. You develop strategies to deal with this. A gentle breeze from the window helps, as does keeping your workspace scrupulously clean so flies aren't attracted to food scraps or spilled drops of ink. Through all of this, the work continues. Page after page, day after day, year after year, you've developed chronic pain in your right hand now, especially in your thumb and first 2 fingers. This is so common among scribes that there's a term for it. You've heard it called scribe's cramp. Some of the older monks in the scriptorium have gnarled, twisted fingers from decades of this work. You try to stretch your hand regularly, flexing and extending your fingers to keep them limber, but you know that eventually the damage will be permanent. Your eyesight, too, is beginning to suffer. The years of focusing on tiny letters in varying light conditions have left you somewhat nearsighted. This is ironic and cruel. Just as your skill reaches its peak, just as your hand knows the shapes of letters with perfect intimacy, your eyes are beginning to fail. You find yourself holding the exemplar closer to your face, squinting to make out faded letters. Brother Marcus, seeing this, suggests that you begin training a younger monk to take over your work when the time comes. This moment, the realization that you won't personally complete the project you've dedicated years to, is both humbling and strangely liberating. You're part of a continuous chain of copiers stretching backward and forward through time. The exemplar you're copying from was copied by someone else who copied it from someone else, back through generations. The copy you're creating will, God willing, be copied by others in the future, forward through generations. You're not creating something that belongs to you. You're serving as a temporary custodian of knowledge, passing it along to the next keeper. As the 5th year of your work on the Psalms begins, you're nearing completion. You can see the end now, perhaps 6 more months of work, maybe a year if there are interruptions for holy days or illness. The illuminator has been gradually working through your completed pages, adding the decorated capitals and marginalia. When you see his work, the brilliant reds and blues, the delicate gold leaf that catches the light, the tiny detailed images of birds and vines and angels in the margins, you're reminded that your plain text is only the foundation. The illuminator's art transforms the book into something that glorifies God visually as well as textually. But there's a nagging question that follows you as you approach completion. When this book is finished, when it's bound and placed in the library or sent as a gift to another monastery, who will read it? Books in medieval monasteries weren't read the way we read books today. They weren't casually browsed or read for entertainment. They were precious objects, too valuable to be handled carelessly. Your Psalter might be read aloud during liturgy. It might be studied by monks preparing for prayer. It might simply sit in the library as a treasure, proof of the monastery's dedication to preserving God's Word. Does that matter? Does it matter if anyone reads it? Or is the value in the act of creation itself, in the decades of careful copying, in the discipline and patience required? The completion of your Psalter comes on a Tuesday in early autumn, 6 years and 4 months after you copied the first word. The final verse is from Psalm 150. Let everything that has breath praise the Lord, praise the Lord. You write the last letter, a careful, deliberate at the end of dominum, and then you sit very still for a moment, your quill hovering above the parchment. It's done. There's no celebration, no announcement. The other monks in the scriptorium continue their work, the scratch of their quills unchanged. Brother Marcus will need to review your final pages, checking for errors. The illuminator still has months of work ahead of him, adding decorated capitals and marginal illustrations to the sections you've recently completed. The book won't be truly finished until it's been corrected, illuminated, and bound. But your part, the 6 years and 4 months of daily copying, is complete. You clean your quill carefully, stopper your ink, and close the exemplar you've been working from. Then you kneel at your desk and pray quietly, thanking God for the strength to complete this work, asking forgiveness for any errors you may have introduced despite your best efforts, and requesting blessing for all who might read this book in the years to come. The next day you begin a new project. This time it's a copy of St. Augustine's Confessions, one of the most important theological works in Christianity. You're excited about this assignment. Augustine's Latin prose is beautiful, complex, and intellectually demanding in a way that biblical copying sometimes isn't. But you're also aware that this project might take even longer than the Psalter. The Confessions is a substantial work, and unlike biblical books, there's no guarantee that your exemplar is error-free. Augustine's works were copied and recopied extensively, and textual variations abound. As you begin this new work, You think about what the past 6 years have taught you. You've learned patience, obviously. Patience at a level that would be almost incomprehensible to people in later centuries. But you've also learned something subtler about the nature of knowledge and its preservation. In an age without printing, every book is unique. Even copies of the same text are individual objects, each with its own history, its own slight variations, its own physical characteristics. The parchment comes from different animals. The ink is mixed in slightly different proportions. The scribe's hand shapes letters in distinctive ways. Your lowercase a has a particular flourish that Brother Thomas's a lacks. When scholars in later centuries study medieval manuscripts, they'll be able to identify individual scribes by these tiny distinctive features, reading personality and individual history into the anonymous labor of copying. Your completed psalter, once it's illuminated and bound, will weigh about 15 pounds. It will have thick wooden covers wrapped in leather, with metal clasps to keep it closed. These clasps aren't just decorative. They're necessary because parchment naturally wants to return to the curved shape of the animal it came from, so books must be kept firmly closed, or the pages will warp. The book will be chained to a lectern in the library or chapel, the chain running through a metal ring attached to the cover. This isn't because the monks don't trust each other, but because books are simply too valuable to risk losing. Your psalter represents the lives of 300 sheep for the parchment. Countless hours of labor in preparation and copying, expensive pigments imported from across Europe and beyond for the illumination, and 6 years of your life. In economic terms, it's worth roughly the same as a small farm. But here's what's remarkable. Your monastery will, if asked, loan this book to another monastery. Medieval monasteries formed networks of book sharing, lending precious volumes back and forth so that monks at different locations could copy texts not available in their own libraries. Your psalter might travel to a monastery 200 miles away, where another monk will spend years copying it, creating yet another iteration of this text, and that copy might travel somewhere else, spawn another copy, and so on. This system, slow, decentralized, vulnerable to error and loss, was nevertheless remarkably effective. When printing finally arrived in Europe in the mid-15th century, scholars were astonished at the number of ancient texts that had survived. Virtually every classical Latin text we have today survived because medieval monks copied it. Many texts survive in only 1 or 2 medieval manuscripts. If a single monastery had failed to copy them, or if a fire had destroyed one library, those texts would be lost forever. You think about this. Sometimes as you work on Augustine's Confessions, the T exemplar you're copying from is itself a copy made about 70 years ago at a monastery in Germany. That copy was made from an exemplar that came from northern Italy, which was copied from an exemplar from southern France, and so on back through the centuries. Somewhere in that chain of copying, there's a manuscript that was made within a few generations of Augustine himself, who died in 430 AD. Your copy, made in the 1150s, is separated from Augustine by more than 700 years and dozens of copying generations. Yet Augustine's words reach you across that gulf of time. As you copy his confession of stealing pears as a boy, his meditation on time and memory, his description of his mother Monica's death, you feel a strange intimacy with this man who lived in an utterly different world. The copying process forces you to engage with every single word he wrote, to follow his thoughts at the pace of handwriting rather than the pace of reading. You inhabit his prose in a way that's deeper than ordinary reading. This intimate, slow engagement with text is perhaps the hidden gift of the copying process. Modern readers can skim, can skip ahead, can read diagonally for main ideas. You can't. You must proceed word by word, letter by letter at the pace of your hand. This enforced slowness creates a kind of meditative reading, a deep absorption in the text that's difficult to achieve through normal reading. Some monks, never fully learn to read Latin fluently despite years in the monastery. But even these monks, when they copy Latin texts, develop a kind of bodily knowledge of the language. Their hands know how Latin words are shaped and structured, even if their minds don't fully grasp the meaning. There's something profound in this. Knowledge held not in the conscious mind, but in the trained body. In the muscle memory of fingers that have formed Latin words thousands upon thousands of times. As you work on the Confessions, you develop a new awareness of Augustine's style. He has favorite phrases that recur throughout his work. Certain sentence structures appear again and again. You notice these patterns not through analytical reading, but through the physical experience of writing them repeatedly. Your hand learns Augustine's rhythms before your mind does. Years pass. The Confessions project continues. You're slower now. Your hand pain has worsened, and your eyesight continues to deteriorate. Some days you can only manage a few hours of copying before the pain becomes too intense. Brother Marcus, now in his late 70s, has trained a younger monk to take over most of the correction work, though he still reviews difficult passages. One winter, an illness sweeps through the monastery. Several monks die, including one of your fellow scribes, Brother William, who had been working on a copy of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. His death is mourned, of course, but there's also a practical problem. His manuscript is unfinished. Someone must take it over and complete it. The task falls to you as the most experienced scribe available. So now you're working on two projects simultaneously, continuing your Confessions and finishing Brother William's Boethius. This is more difficult than you expected. Not technically, but emotionally. You have to learn Brother William's handwriting, to match your letters to his so the transition between scribes is as seamless as possible. In doing so, you become intensely aware of Brother William as an individual. His particular way of forming the letter G, the slight rightward slant of his lines, the places where his hand hesitated or moved with confidence. Completing his work feels like a kind of communion with the dead. You're continuing his labor, bringing to completion what he couldn't finish, and you realize that the same thing will happen to you someday. You'll die with projects uncompleted, and other monks will take up your quills and finish what you began. This realization doesn't sadden you as much as you might have expected. Instead, it reinforces the sense that you're part of something larger and longer lasting than any individual life. The work of copying, of preserving knowledge, isn't about individual achievement. It's about maintaining a chain of transmission that stretches backward to antiquity and forward into an unknown future. By the time you finish Brother William's Boethius, you're in your late 50s, elderly by medieval standards. Your hands are so gnarled now that holding a quill is painful even on good days. Your eyesight has deteriorated to the point where you can barely make out the letters in your exemplar, even in bright sunlight. The abbot, recognizing that your copying days are nearing their end, assigns you lighter duties. You now spend most of your time preparing parchment, mixing ink, and training younger monks in the art of copying. Teaching is its own revelation. You discover that you've internalized knowledge you didn't even know you possessed. When a young monk asks you how to hold a quill properly, you find yourself demonstrating angles and grips that you've never consciously thought about. Your hands simply know. When another novice struggles with maintaining consistent letter height, you can diagnose the problem at a glance and prescribe exercises to develop better control. Your unfinished Confessions is assigned to Brother Peter, a young monk with exceptional skill and patience. You spend several days with him, showing him your exemplar, explaining the textual issues you've encountered, sharing the choices you've made when the exemplar was unclear or damaged. Brother Peter listens carefully, asks thoughtful questions, and then begins where you left off. Watching him work, Seeing him form letters in his own distinctive hand while continuing your project, you feel a deep satisfaction. The work will continue. The chain holds. In your final years, before your hands become too crippled to hold anything at all, you work on a special project, creating a guide for future scribes. This isn't a common practice. Most scribal knowledge is transmitted orally through demonstration and practice rather than written instruction. But you feel compelled to write down what you've learned. You describe how to prepare quills, how to mix ink for different weather conditions, how to recognize and correct common errors, how to maintain concentration through long hours of tedious work. This guide will survive. Centuries later, historians studying medieval manuscript production will discover it and recognize its value. Your observations about maintaining focus, about the relationship between physical comfort and mental clarity, about the importance of regular breaks and hand exercises. All of this will seem remarkably modern, anticipating insights from ergonomics and cognitive science. But you don't write the guide for future historians. You write it for the next generation of monks in your own monastery, for young men who will spend decades as you did, copying word after word, line after line, page after page. You write it so they might suffer a little less, work a little more efficiently, and understand a little better the profound importance of what they're doing, because that's what you've come to understand. After all these years, the copying of manuscripts isn't just about preserving words on pages. It's about maintaining human connection across time. Every book you copy is a conversation between you and the original author, between you and the previous copyists, between you and unknown future readers. You're not just preserving information, you're preserving the possibility of thought, the capacity for people separated by centuries to share ideas and experiences. When you die, several years after laying down your quill for the last time, the monastery's necrology, the book recording the deaths of monks, notes that you copied 3 complete books and assisted with 7 others. That's your legacy in their eyes. 10 books that will outlive you, that will carry knowledge forward into a future you'll never see. But perhaps the deeper legacy is harder to quantify. It's in the younger monks you trained who will train others in turn. It's in the marginal notes you left in manuscripts, explaining textual difficulties for future readers. It's in the guide you wrote, with its patient explanations of techniques and its quiet insistence on the dignity and importance of slow, careful work. In the end, the question isn't really about what makes someone capable of dedicating their life to such painstakingly slow work. The question is about value, what we consider worth preserving and what we're willing to sacrifice to preserve it. Medieval monks understood that knowledge is fragile, that every book is a miracle of survival, that the thread connecting us to the past is gossamer thin and can break at any moment. They dedicated their lives to strengthening that thread, one copied word at a time, and because they did, because thousands of anonymous monks spent decades in cold scriptoriums, hunched over desks, straining their eyes and cramping their hands, we still have Virgil and Ovid, Augustine and Boethius, Plato and Aristotle in Latin translation. We have the biblical text that shaped Western civilization. We have the chronicles and histories, the scientific treatises and philosophical dialogues, the poetry and theology that form the foundation of European culture. Every word in every one of those texts passed through the hands of monks like you. Every word was copied, carefully checked, corrected, preserved. The books survived because someone believed they were worth the sacrifice. That's the real story here. Not speed or efficiency, not individual genius or dramatic discovery, but patient, anonymous, decades-long labor in service of something larger than any individual life. It's boring history in the best sense, slow, undramatic, and absolutely essential. Silence wasn't just a rule in medieval monasteries, it was a theology. a discipline and a way of life that shaped every waking hour. For modern people accustomed to constant noise, music, television, conversation, the hum of machines, the idea of spending years, even decades, in near total silence seems almost unimaginable. Yet for medieval monks, silence was considered the natural state of a soul oriented toward God. Speech was the exception, carefully rationed and strictly controlled. To understand monastic silence, we need to go back to its origins in the Rule of Saint Benedict, written around 530 AD in Italy. Benedict of Nursia was establishing guidelines for communal religious life, and he devoted considerable attention to the problem of speech. "Let us do as the prophet says," Benedict wrote, quoting Psalm 39. "I said, I will guard my ways that I may not sin with my tongue. I have set a guard to my mouth." For Benedict, unnecessary speech wasn't just a minor fault. It was a pathway to sin, a crack through which pride, anger, gossip, and falsehood could enter the soul. The Rule of Saint Benedict distinguishes between necessary speech and idle chatter. Necessary speech includes the words of liturgy, essential questions about work or daily needs, and conversations specifically permitted by the abbot. Everything else falls under the category of idle words. And Benedict quotes Matthew 12:36 as a warning. "On the day of judgment, men will render account for every careless word they utter." Think about that for a moment. Every careless word, every bit of small talk, every joke, every casual comment about the weather, or your health, or what you had for breakfast. All of it recorded, all of it to be judged. From this perspective, speech becomes terrifyingly dangerous. Better to say nothing at all than to risk eternal consequences for momentary, meaningless words. So medieval monasteries developed elaborate systems to minimize speech while still allowing necessary communication. Let's place you in a different monastery now. A Cistercian abbey in Yorkshire, England, in the year 1180. The Cistercians are a reformed branch of Benedictine monasticism, and they take the rule of silence even more seriously than most other orders. In your monastery, speech is forbidden at all times except in 3 specific locations: the chapter house where the community meets for business, the abbot's chambers when called for a private conversation, and the novice master's cell during instruction of new monks. Everywhere else, the church, the dormitory, the refectory where you eat, the cloister where you walk, the fields where you work, the scriptorium where you study, silence is absolute. You are not permitted to speak. You are not permitted to whisper. You are not permitted to hum or sing outside of liturgical contexts. Even unnecessary noise is discouraged. You learn to walk softly, to close doors gently, to move through space as quietly as possible. But humans need to communicate. Work requires coordination. Questions arise. Information must be shared. So your monastery, like all silent monasteries, has developed a sophisticated system of hand signals, a sign language that allows monks to convey necessary information without breaking silence. The sign language is extensive. There are signs for common food items. Bread is indicated by forming a circle with your fingers, fish by moving your hand in a swimming motion, cheese by pressing your palms together and twisting them as if forming a wheel. There are signs for objects. A book is shown by opening your hands like pages, a knife by drawing your finger across your palm, a candle by raising one finger upward. There are signs for people. The abbot is indicated by placing 2 fingers on your forehead like a mitre, the prior by touching your temple, a sick brother by pointing to the infirmary. More abstract concepts require more complex signs. Good is shown by kissing your fingers. Bad is indicated by spitting or making a spitting gesture. Soon is conveyed by tapping your palm quickly. Later by tapping slowly. Question by raising your eyebrows and tilting your head. Yes by nodding. Know by shaking your head some gestures are universal. You learn this sign language during your novitiate, the year of training before you take permanent vows. The novice master teaches you dozens of signs which you practice with other novices during the 1 hour each day, when speech is permitted in the novice quarters. Some signs are intuitive, mimicking the thing they represent. Others are arbitrary conventions that must be memorized. The sign for Sunday, for instance, is touching your eye with one finger. This derives from Dominica, the Lord's Day, which starts with the same letter as Dominus and Lord, whose sign involves pointing to heaven. The connections can be obscure, almost cryptic, but you learn them through repetition. What you discover as you adapt to this silent life is that communication without words changes the nature of communication itself. Sign language is efficient for concrete, immediate needs. Pass the bread, bring the tool. Go to the chapel, but it's nearly useless for abstract discussion, for sharing feelings or ideas, for the kind of casual conversation that builds social bonds. You can't tell a joke in sign language, not really. You can't gossip. You can't philosophize or debate or share a story about your childhood. This limitation is, of course, entirely intentional. The goal of monastic silence isn't just to reduce noise. It's to reduce the social entanglements that speech creates. Speech builds relationships, but relationships can become attachments, and attachments can distract from the monk's primary relationship, which is with God. A monk who spends his days in animated conversation with his brothers is a monk whose attention is directed horizontally toward other humans rather than vertically toward heaven. The enforcement of silence varies depending on the specific location and activity within the monastery. In the church during the divine office, the 8 daily prayer services that structure monastic life, absolute silence reigns except for the voices of chanters and readers. The prayers and psalms are sung or recited according to precise liturgical rules, and every monk knows his part. Outside of these designated vocal roles, you remain silent even in church. If you need to cough, you do so as quietly as possible. If you need to leave, for illness or urgent necessity, you do so without explanation, slipping out as unobtrusively as you can. In the refectory during meals, silence is equally absolute, but it's a different kind of silence. While monks eat, one brother reads aloud from an approved text, usually scripture or the lives of saints or the rule of Saint Benedict itself. The reader stands at a lectern, projecting his voice to be heard throughout the hall, while the rest of you eat in silence, listening. This practice, called spiritual reading, transforms mealtime from a purely physical necessity into a time of edification. Your body is fed while your soul receives nourishment through hearing God's word. The food itself is eaten in absolute quiet. If you need something, more bread, a cup of water, you use hand signs to request it from your neighbor or from the serving monks who circulate through the refectory. The only sounds are the reader's voice, the clink of spoons against bowls, and the occasional scrape of a bench. It's during these meals that the strangeness of silence becomes most apparent to new monks. Eating is such a social activity in the outside world, a time for conversation and laughter. In the monastery, it becomes a solitary experience conducted in a crowd, each monk alone with his thoughts and the words being read aloud. In the dormitory where you sleep, silence takes on yet another character. The dormitory is a long room with simple beds arranged in rows, just a straw mattress, a rough blanket, and perhaps a small wooden partition between beds for minimal privacy. You sleep fully dressed in your habit, ready to rise quickly for the night offices. When the bell rings for matins at 2 a.m, you must rise, dress quickly if needed, and proceed to the church without a word. In the darkness, you hear only the rustle of fabric, the soft padding of bare feet on stone, the occasional suppressed cough. This nighttime silence has a particular quality, a thickness, almost a weight. In the deep hours of the night when the whole world seems to sleep, The silence of the monastery becomes profound. You become aware of sounds you'd never noticed during the day. The wind against the walls, the distant hoot of an owl, the creak of old timbers settling, your own breathing. In this silence, alone with your thoughts in the middle of the night, prayer takes on a different character. There are no distractions, no pressing duties, just you and God and the darkness. The workspace, whether it's the scriptorium for copying manuscripts, the fields for agricultural work, or the workshops for various crafts, presents special challenges for maintaining silence. Work requires coordination. Someone needs to make decisions about how tasks should be accomplished. Problems arise that need solving. The sign language helps, but it has limits. Imagine you're working in the fields during harvest, cutting wheat with a scythe. You notice that your blade is dull and needs sharpening. You could signal this to the work coordinator, the monk assigned to oversee the day's labor, by miming the action of sharpening. But what if you want to suggest a different approach to the work? Or point out a problem with the equipment that doesn't have a specific sign? You can't. You must either work around the problem yourself or wait until the next chapter meeting when speech is permitted. This constraint fundamentally changes how work is organized. Monastic labor becomes less collaborative and more individualized. Each monk knows his assigned task and carries it out with minimal coordination with others. The work coordinator assigns duties using hand signals at the beginning of the work period, and then each monk proceeds independently. If you finish your task early, you look for obvious next steps. There's always more wheat to cut, more weeds to pull, rather than asking what to do. Over time, you develop an intuitive understanding of the work rhythms and your brother's tendencies. You learn to read body language with exquisite sensitivity. A brother's posture tells you whether he's tiring and might need help. The pace of his movements indicates whether he's struggling with his task. A glance and a nod can convey complex meaning. I see you need help, I'll come over when I finish this section. Silence makes you more observant, more attuned to nonverbal cues. But silence also creates distance. Without casual conversation, you know your brothers in only the most superficial ways. You know Brother Thomas is strong and works steadily. You know Brother Edmund tires easily and sometimes struggles with the heavy labor. But you don't know their thoughts, their fears, their histories before entering the monastery. You might live and work alongside the same men for decades without ever having a real conversation with them. This emotional distance is again intentional. Particular friendships, close bonds between individual monks, are discouraged in monastic life. Such friendships create divisions within the community, pairs or small groups that separate themselves from the whole. They also create emotional attachments that can rival the monk's attachment to God. Better to maintain a general, equal charity toward all brothers than to form specific, deep bonds with a few. The question that begins to trouble you, perhaps a year or two into your silent life, is whether this is healthy, whether human beings are meant to live this way. You're a social creature, after all. You have an innate need for connection, for communication, for the give and take of conversation. Suppressing that need doesn't make it go away. It just drives it inward, where it manifests in other ways. Some monks, you notice, become obsessed with the chapter meetings, the one time each week when speech is permitted for community business. They prepare little speeches in their minds, rehearsing what they'll say about various matters. Others become almost manic during the brief recreation periods when conversation is allowed, talking rapidly as if trying to fit weeks' worth of words into a single hour. Still others seem to withdraw entirely into themselves, becoming so habituated to silence that even when speech is permitted, they have little to say. And you? How does the silence affect you? That's the question that lingers as you lie in your bed at night. listening to the breathing of 40 other monks in the darkened dormitory, each of you alone together in the quiet. The psychological effects of prolonged silence are subtle at first, then profound. In your third year of observing strict silence, you begin to notice changes in how you think, how you perceive the world, even how you understand yourself. The most immediate change is in your interior life. Without the constant outlet of speech, your thoughts don't dissipate into conversation. They accumulate, circling back on themselves, becoming more complex and layered. An observation that you might once have shared immediately, "The apples are particularly good this year," instead remains in your mind. You think about why the apples are good. You remember last year's harvest? You contemplate the relationship between weather and fruit quality. You consider the metaphorical significance of fruitfulness. What began as a simple observation becomes a meditation. This is exactly what the rule of Saint Benedict intended. Silence creates space for contemplation. It forces you inward, toward what the medieval monks called the interior cell, the space within your own mind and heart where you meet God. Saint Benedict wrote that the life of a monk ought to be a continuous Lent, a perpetual state of introspection and spiritual discipline. Silence is the tool that makes this possible. But there's a darker side to this inward turn. Without external conversation to check and balance your thoughts, you can spiral into rumination. A small slight, real or imagined, from another monk can occupy your thoughts for days. Brother Andrew didn't make eye contact during morning prayers. Does he dislike you? Are you somehow offensive? Have you committed some fault you're unaware of? These questions churn in your mind with no way to resolve them. You can't simply ask Brother Andrew what's wrong. You can't clear the air with a conversation. The slight, whether real or imagined, festers. Some monks develop what you might call an obsessive quality to their thoughts. Brother Geoffrey, you notice, has a particular concern with cleanliness. During manual labor, he's constantly brushing dirt from his habit, examining his hands, wiping his face. In the refectory, he inspects his bowl and spoon meticulously before eating. This behavior would be unremarkable if it occurred occasionally, but it's constant, compulsive. You wonder if Brother Geoffrey was always this way, or if the silence has allowed a minor tendency to grow unchecked into something more troubling. You notice similar patterns in other monks. Brother Martin seems perpetually anxious, his eyes darting, his movements jerky and uncertain. Brother Hugh has developed a slight rocking motion during prayers, swaying forward and back rhythmically. These behaviors might serve as self-soothing mechanisms, ways of managing internal stress without the release valve of conversation. The sign language, meanwhile, evolves in ways the rule never anticipated. Officially, it's supposed to be used only for necessary communication about work or immediate needs. But monks being human, the sign language becomes a vehicle for forbidden communication. Brothers develop private signs, slight variations on official gestures that convey emotional content. A particular way of signing bread with a slight roll of the eyes can mean "this bread is terrible again." A gesture for work, accompanied by a subtle grimace, conveys, "I'm dreading this task." Even more subversively, some monks begin to spell out words using a finger alphabet, touching different parts of their palm to indicate different letters. This is explicitly forbidden, as it defeats the entire purpose of the sign language, which is supposed to be limited to concrete necessities. Finger spelling allows for any communication whatsoever, effectively recreating speech through gesture. When the abbot discovers this practice, he issues a stern warning during chapter. Several monks are assigned penances, extra fasts, additional prayers for violating the spirit of the rule. The chapter meetings themselves, held weekly in the chapter house, become the primary outlet for verbal communication. The chapter house is a rectangular room with stone benches along the walls, where all the monks sit facing the abbot, who occupies a chair at one end. These meetings follow a strict structure. First, a section of the rule is read aloud and the abbot provides commentary. Then comes the chapter of faults here, where monks confess their failings and receive penances. This confession process is public and ritualized. A monk who has committed a fault, arriving late to prayers, breaking something through carelessness, falling asleep during the night office, steps forward and prostrates himself face down on the floor. "I confess my fault," he says, describing what he did wrong. The abbot assigns a penance, usually something like fasting from the evening meal or reciting additional psalms. The monk kisses the abbot's ring, returns to his place, and the next confession begins. But the chapter of fault serves another purpose beyond discipline. It's one of the few times when a monk can speak, can use his voice, can hear himself make sounds beyond the carefully controlled words of liturgy. Some monks, you notice, confess remarkably minor faults. "I allowed my attention to wander briefly during Vespers. I walked too quickly in the cloister. Faults so small they hardly seem worth mentioning." You suspect these brothers are motivated less by genuine guilt than by the need to speak, to participate in verbal communication even in this limited, formulaic way. After the chapter of faults comes the business portion of the meeting. The abbot discusses practical matters, repairs needed in the monastery, the harvest progress, visitors expected, arrangements for feast days. Monks may ask questions or offer information relevant to their duties. This is supposed to be strictly practical communication, but it too becomes an outlet for something more. A monk assigned to the kitchen might give an unnecessarily detailed report on food supplies, lingering over his words, savoring the act of speaking. Another might ask a question that could easily be conveyed through signs, justifying it as necessary clarity but really just wanting to use his voice. You become aware of how precious speech is through its scarcity. In the outside world, people waste words constantly, talking without thinking, filling silence with meaningless noise. Here each spoken word carries weight. When you do speak during chapter, you find yourself choosing words carefully, considering their exact meaning and effect. Speech becomes a formal act, like putting on ceremonial vestments. But this formality has costs. You begin to forget how to engage in casual conversation. During the rare recreation periods when speech is permitted, perhaps an hour on Sunday afternoons, you find yourself at a loss. What do you talk about? The weather? Your work? These topics seem trivial, not worthy of breaking silence. Deeper topics, theology, philosophy, personal struggles, seem too weighty for casual conversation. So you and your brothers often spend recreation time in awkward, halting exchanges, unable to bridge the gap between formal chapter speech and genuine conversation. Some monks handle this better than others. Brother Paul, who entered the monastery later in life after years as a merchant, retains his ease with conversation. During recreation, he tells stories about his travels, describes people he met, shares observations about the world beyond the monastery walls. Other monks gather around him, hungry for this connection to a more verbal way of life. But Brother Paul is exceptional. Most monks, especially those who entered young, seem to have forgotten how ordinary conversation works. The elderly monks present another puzzle. Brother Richard is over 70, having entered the monastery at age 18. He spent more than 50 years in near silence. Watching him during recreation, you notice he speaks very little even when permitted. When he does speak, his voice is soft, almost rusty sounding, as if his vocal cords have partially atrophied from disuse. His sentences are short, simple. The complexity of his inner life, which you sense through his careful work, his attentive presence during liturgy, doesn't translate into words. He's become a man who exists more fully in silence than in speech. You wonder if this will be your future. Will you spend 50 years here, gradually losing your facility with language, your voice becoming a stranger to your own ears? The thought is both disturbing and oddly compelling. There's something appealing about the idea of becoming so deeply interior, so fully absorbed in contemplation, that words become unnecessary. The liturgy provides a middle ground between silence and speech. The divine office, the cycle of 8 prayer services that structure each day, fills the monastery with words. But they're not personal words. You're not speaking. You're participating in a collective voice that's been repeating the same psalms, hymns, and prayers for centuries. Your individual voice merges into the corporate voice of the community, which merges into the eternal voice of the church. There's something profound in this experience. When you chant Psalm 95 at Matins, "Come, let us sing to the Lord. Let us shout for joy to the rock of our salvation," you're not expressing your personal feeling. You might be exhausted, doubting, spiritually dry, but you chant the psalm anyway, lending your voice to words that carry meaning independent of your current state. The liturgy doesn't require your authentic emotional participation. It simply requires your presence and your voice. Over time, this liturgical speech begins to shape your interior life. The psalms you chant daily become the language of your private prayers. When you're troubled, phrases from the penitential psalms arise in your mind. "Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord." When you're grateful, words from the praise psalms emerge. "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me, bless his holy name." The liturgy provides a vocabulary for interior experience that your own words might not capture. But there's also a danger here, the danger of confusing memorized words with genuine prayer. You can chant the liturgy for hours while your mind wanders to completely mundane concerns. What you'll eat, whether your bed needs new straw, the ache in your lower back. The words flow automatically, requiring no conscious attention. This is actually considered a type of fault in monastic spirituality, a failure of attention called acedia, or spiritual sloth. But it's remarkably easy to fall into, precisely because the liturgical words are so familiar. The visiting monks from other monasteries provide interesting contrasts in how silence is practiced. Your Cistercian abbey follows one of the strictest interpretations of silence. But not all monastic orders are equally stringent. When Benedictine monks from a less reformed house visit for a chapter meeting between abbeys, you notice they seem more comfortable with speech, more at ease in conversation during the brief times when it's permitted. Their sign language is less developed. They seem to rely more on occasional whispered words than on elaborate gestures. This raises questions in your mind. Is your monastery's extreme silence truly necessary? Or has it become an end in itself, a form of spiritual pride? We are more disciplined, more pure than those other monks. The rule of Saint Benedict calls for silence, yes, but it doesn't specify the exact degree of silence your order practices. That's an interpretation, a choice made by the founders of the Cistercian reform. Could different choices be equally valid? These questions trouble you, but there's no one you can discuss them with. During chapter, such theological questioning would be inappropriate, possibly even dangerous. It might be seen as criticism of the order, as a failure of obedience, so the questions remain internal, circling in your mind without resolution. You begin to notice how silence affects your dreams. Without the day's experiences being verbalized and processed through conversation, your dreams become more vivid, more complex. You dream of talking, long, flowing conversations where words pour out effortlessly. Sometimes you dream of your life before the monastery, of your family and friends, of casual exchanges about nothing in particular. You wake from these dreams with a sense of loss, grieving for the simple human connection that speech enables. Other dreams are stranger. You dream in images and sensations rather than narrative. You dream of colors, of sounds, of tactile experiences, the feel of stone under your hand, the taste of bread, the smell of incense. It's as if your dreaming mind, deprived of verbal content during waking hours, has shifted to a more primitive pre-linguistic mode of processing experience. The question that gnaws at you, as your 5th year in the monastery approaches, is whether this silence is bringing you closer to God, or simply making you stranger, more isolated, less human. The traditional answer is that it's doing both, that the path to God requires becoming strange to the world, that holiness and isolation are inseparable. But you're not sure. You look at the elderly monks, the ones who've spent decades in silence, and you can't tell whether they've achieved spiritual enlightenment or simply withdrawn into impenetrable interiority. Brother Richard, the 70-year-old, sometimes has a quality you can only describe as luminous. During prayers, his face takes on an expression of deep peace, as if he's experiencing something beyond words, beyond thought. But other times he seems simply absent, disconnected from the world around him. Which is the truth? Is he a saint or simply a man who's forgotten how to be fully human? And which will you become? The answer begins to clarify during your 7th year in the monastery. Though not in the way you expected, it comes through a series of small revelations rather than a single dramatic insight. And it starts with a crisis in the community. Brother Edmund, a monk in his early 40s who has been in the monastery since his teenage years, begins to break down. The signs are subtle at first. He arrives late to prayers, which is unusual for him. His work in the scriptorium becomes careless. He makes copying errors he never would have made before. During meals, he doesn't eat, just stares at his bowl while the reader's voice echoes through the refectory. Then one morning during lauds, the dawn prayer service, Brother Edmund simply walks out of the church in the middle of a psalm. He doesn't signal distress or ask permission. He just stands up and leaves. The other monks continue chanting, but there's a ripple of awareness through the community. Something is very wrong. The abbot speaks with Brother Edmund privately. What's said in that conversation you never learn. But at the next chapter meeting, the abbot addresses the community about the dangers of isolation within community, about the importance of recognizing when a brother is struggling. Our silence is meant to draw us closer to God, he says, but it should not separate us from one another. We are a community, a body with many members. When one member suffers, we all suffer. He announces a modification to the rule as practiced in your monastery. Once each month, monks will be paired for a conversation walk in the cloister. For 1 hour, the paired monks will be permitted, indeed required, to speak with each other about their spiritual state, their struggles, their needs. This is presented not as a relaxation of discipline, but as a recognition that complete silence can become its own form of pride, a refusal of the human need for connection that God himself created. The first time you're paired with another monk for this conversation walk, it's with Brother Thomas, the strong, steady worker you've labored alongside in the fields for years. You know his habits, his rhythms, the way he moves through space, but you don't know him, not really. As you walk together in the cloister, both of you seem uncertain how to begin. Finally, Brother Thomas speaks. I find it difficult, he says, his voice rough from disuse, to pray without distraction. My mind wanders constantly. I wonder if I'm failing in my vocation. The admission is startling in its vulnerability. You respond haltingly, admitting your own struggles with attention during the long hours of liturgy. The conversation flows slowly with long pauses, but gradually you both relax into it. Brother Thomas tells you he entered the monastery to escape a family situation he doesn't detail. You share that you sometimes dream of your old life and wake feeling guilty, as if longing for the past is a betrayal of your vows. By the end of the hour, nothing has been solved, no great insights achieved. But you both feel lighter, less alone. The burden of your interior struggles has been shared, made bearable through acknowledgement. You realize that the silence, for all its spiritual value, had been allowing your private worries to grow unchecked, like weeds in an untended garden. Over subsequent months, you're paired with different monks for these conversation walks. Each brother reveals aspects of himself that years of silent coexistence never disclosed. Brother Martin, whose anxious demeanor you'd noticed, admits he suffers from profound doubt about God's existence, doubts he's never been able to voice. Brother Hugh, with his rocking during prayers, describes a childhood trauma that still haunts him. Brother Jeffrey's obsession with cleanliness stems from having watched his family die of plague when he was young. These conversations don't undermine the value of silence. If anything, they enhance it. Knowing your brother's struggles makes the shared silence more meaningful. When you see Brother Martin's anxious face during prayers, you now pray for him specifically, asking God to ease his doubts. When Brother Jeffrey washes his hands repeatedly before meals, you understand it as a response to old trauma, rather than mere peculiarity. The silence becomes less isolating because it's punctuated by moments of genuine connection. Brother Edmund gradually recovers, though he's never quite the same. The abbot assigns him lighter duties, and he's excused from the night offices to allow more sleep. During the conversation walks, he speaks little, but his presence in the community stabilizes. The crisis passes. This experience teaches you something crucial about monastic silence. It's not an absolute good in itself. It's a tool, and like any tool, it must be used wisely with attention to its effects. Silence creates space for prayer and contemplation. It reduces the distractions and entanglements that speech creates. It disciplines the mind and heart. But silence taken to an extreme can also isolate, can allow interior problems to fester unchecked, can make monks strange rather than holy. The wisdom of the rule of Saint Benedict, you come to understand, lies in its balance. Benedict advocated silence, yes, but he also required communal life, shared work, and the chapter meetings where speech was permitted. He understood that humans need both solitude and community, both silence and speech. The problem arises when later reformers, in their zeal for purity, push one element to an extreme at the expense of others. Your understanding of liturgical speech also deepens during these years. You've been chanting the Psalms for 7 years now, and they've become part of your mental furniture, always available in memory. But you begin to notice something interesting. The Psalms contain every human emotion and experience. There are psalms of praise, yes, but also psalms of lament, anger, doubt, fear, even cursing of enemies. The psalmist cries out to God in despair, questions why God has abandoned him, rails against injustice. This emotional range matters because it gives you permission to bring your whole self to prayer, not just the pious, peaceful parts. When you're angry at another monk, at your own failings, at the sometimes harsh conditions of monastic life, Psalm 137 gives you words. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept. When you're depressed and God seems absent, Psalm 22 speaks for you. My God, why have you forsaken me? The liturgy doesn't require you to fake emotions you don't feel. It provides words for the reality of human experience, including the dark parts. This realization changes your relationship to the liturgical silence. Between the spoken prayers and psalms, there are long moments of silence during the divine office. Pauses for personal prayer, for letting the words just chanted sink into your heart. You used to experience these silences as empty spaces, as simply the absence of words. Now you understand them as full silences, pregnant with meaning. Spaces where the words you've just chanted can resonate and deepen. The elderly Brother Richard becomes something of a teacher to you, though almost entirely through example rather than words. During one of your monthly conversation walks, you're paired with him. You expect little. He rarely speaks even when permitted, but on this day he surprises you. Silence is a language, he says slowly, his voice thin but clear. When you are young in the monastery, Silence feels like deprivation, like holding your tongue when you want to speak. But after many years, silence becomes its own form of communication. I can pray for you without words. I can sense when a brother is troubled without asking. The silence connects us at a level deeper than speech. You ask him about the luminous quality you've sometimes noticed in his face during prayers. He's quiet for a long moment and you think perhaps he won't answer. Then, sometimes, rarely during the liturgy, the words fall away and there is only presence. God's presence, but also my own presence, fully realized. Those moments are brief and I cannot make them happen. But they come more often now than when I was young and still fighting the silence, still wanting to fill it with my own thoughts. This conversation stays with you for months. Brother Richard is describing something you've only glimpsed. A state where silence isn't the absence of communication, but its deepest form. You're not there yet. You're still too attached to words, still too hungry for conversation. But you can imagine now what decades more of practice might bring. How silence might eventually become not a discipline you impose on yourself, but your natural state, a medium in which you move as easily as a fish moves through water. The monastery's liturgical year provides another dimension to silence. Certain seasons emphasize silence more than others. During Lent, the 40 days before Easter, even the monthly conversation walks are suspended. Additional restrictions are imposed. Sign language is limited to absolute necessities only. The meals are simpler and the portions smaller, adding physical hunger to the silence. The entire monastery takes on a quality of waiting, of emptiness preparing to be filled. Then Easter arrives with an explosion of words and sound. The bells ring out, previously silent since Maundy Thursday. The liturgy is sung rather than merely chanted, with elaborate melodies. The readings are longer, more numerous. During the recreation periods that week, conversation is not just permitted but encouraged. There's even laughter, a sound so rare in the monastery that it startles you when you first hear it. Brother Paul telling a story about a confused visitor who thought the monastery was a prison and the monks were inmates. This rhythm of intensified silence followed by relative openness teaches you about the purpose of silence. It's not meant to be a permanent state but rather a preparation, a clearing away of noise to make room for something else. The silence of Lent makes the joy of Easter more profound. The words of the Easter liturgy, Christ is risen. He is risen indeed, carry more weight because they break a long silence. You begin to apply this rhythm to your own interior life. Instead of trying to maintain constant vigilance against stray thoughts during the long hours of silence, you allow your mind more freedom during work periods, while intensifying your focus during the liturgy itself. Instead of judging yourself harshly for wanting conversation, you accept that desire as human and natural, while also appreciating the gifts that silence brings. The goal isn't to kill your need for speech, but to find the right balance between speech and silence, between community and solitude, between giving voice to your experience and letting that experience deepen in wordless contemplation. By your 10th year in the monastery, silence has become something different than it was when you entered. It's no longer a rule you follow, an imposition from outside. It's become a choice you make moment by moment, recognizing that speech has its place but that silence often serves you better. When you do speak, during chapter, during the monthly conversation walks, during the liturgy, your words carry more weight because they're rarer. You've learned to think before speaking, to choose words with care, to speak only when speech adds something valuable. But you've also learned to recognize when speech is necessary, when silence becomes destructive rather than creative. When you notice a brother struggling, you find ways to check on him. A meaningful glance, a hand on the shoulder, and if needed, a request to the abbot to schedule a conversation walk with that brother. The silence is no longer absolute in your mind. It's a tool to be used wisely, not a law to be followed rigidly. The question you pondered years ago, whether the silence was bringing you closer to God or making you less human, now seems to have been wrongly framed. The silence does both, and that's exactly the point. You become less conventionally human, less talkative and socially engaged, less concerned with the 1,000 small interactions that make up ordinary social life. But in becoming less of that kind of human, you have space to become more fully yourself, more attentive to the deep currents of your inner life, more capable of genuine contemplation and prayer. Brother Edmund, who went through his crisis years ago, pulls you aside after chapter 1 day. "I wanted to thank you," he says quietly. "During my difficult time, I felt your prayers. I couldn't have articulated it then, but now I can. The silence allowed you to pray for me in a way that would have been impossible if we'd all been chattering constantly. Your silent presence was a gift. You're moved by this and also puzzled. You don't remember praying for Brother Edmund specifically during his crisis. You certainly intended to. But your prayer life was so diffuse then, so unfocused. But perhaps that's not the point. Perhaps the intention to pray, held within the silence of the community, creates a kind of spiritual solidarity that operates below the level of conscious thought. Perhaps the silence weaves the monks together in ways that speech never could, creating bonds that don't depend on knowing details about each other's lives, but on simply being present together in the shared discipline. As you grow older in the monastery, you're now approaching middle age by medieval standards. You notice the silence changing your body as well as your mind. Your voice, used only for liturgy and occasional permitted conversation, has a different quality than the voices of visitors from outside the monastery. It's softer, more modulated, lacking the rough edges that come from constant use. Your gestures are more deliberate, more economical. You move through space more quietly, more mindfully. There's a story the older monks tell about a former brother who left the monastery after 20 years to care for his aging mother. He found it almost unbearable to live in the noise of the village. The constant chatter, the barking dogs, the shouts of children, the arguments and laughter and endless human voices. After 6 months, he returned to the monastery, his duty to his mother fulfilled. "The silence here," he said, "is not empty. It's full of God. The noise out there is not full of anything. It's just noise filling space to avoid confronting what's really in the heart." You understand what he meant. The silence has taught you to distinguish between sound that means something and sound that merely fills space. Most speech, you've come to believe, is of the second kind. Nervous chatter, social noise, words deployed to avoid uncomfortable silence rather than to communicate anything essential. The speech that emerges from silence, from genuine contemplation and need, carries a different weight. It's more likely to be true, more likely to matter. This doesn't make you a better person necessarily. You can see ways in which the silence has made you judgmental, even contemptuous of the verbose world outside the monastery walls. You have to guard against spiritual pride, the sense that your silent life is superior to the talkative lives of ordinary people. The rule of Saint Benedict warns against this pride repeatedly. Humility is the foundation of monastic life, and thinking you're more spiritual than others is the opposite of humility. But even with its dangers and difficulties, even with the psychological costs and the human needs it leaves partially unfulfilled, you can't imagine living any other way now. The silence has shaped you so fundamentally that returning to a life of constant speech would feel like trying to wear clothes that no longer fit. You've grown into silence the way a tree grows into its space, your interior life spreading and deepening in directions that only the absence of noise made possible. The wisdom you've gained, if it can be called wisdom, is simple. Silence and speech are both necessary. Each has its place, its proper use, its gifts and dangers. The tragedy is that most people know only speech, only noise, only the constant chatter that fills every moment and prevents deeper awareness. The monastery offers the opposite extreme. Silence so pervasive that speech becomes the exception. The ideal perhaps lies somewhere between these extremes, but very few people ever find that balance. You found your version of it here in this Coldstone Monastery in Yorkshire, rising before dawn to pray, working in silence, eating while scripture is read, sleeping in a room full of quietly breathing men. It's not a life most people would choose or could sustain, but it's your life, and the silence that once seemed like a deprivation now feels like the deepest gift you've ever received. A space empty enough for God to fill, quiet enough to hear the still small voice that speaks only when all other voices cease. Before the medieval monastery, human life followed natural rhythms, the sun's rising and setting, the seasons turning, the body's hunger and fatigue. People woke with the dawn and slept when darkness fell. They ate when food was available. They worked when work needed doing and rested when they were tired. There was hardship, certainly, and unpredictability, but there was also a kind of organic flow to existence. Time was experienced as circular, repetitive, tied to natural cycles rather than measured in precise increments. The monastery changed all of this. For the first time in human history, people began living according to a detailed, rigid schedule that divided every hour of every day into predetermined activities. This schedule didn't respond to natural needs or circumstances. It imposed an artificial structure onto time itself, transforming it from a fluid experience into something that could be measured, divided, and controlled. In doing so, the monastery didn't just organize religious life, it invented a new way of experiencing time that would eventually spread far beyond monastery walls and come to define modern existence. The heart of this transformation was the divine office, the cycle of 8 daily prayer services that structured monastic life. These services had specific names and occurred at specific times. Matins in the middle of the night around 2 a.m, lauds at dawn, prime at sunrise, terce at mid-morning, sext at noon, none in mid-afternoon, vespers at sunset, and compline before bed. Each service consisted of psalms, hymns, readings, and prayers, following patterns that varied according to the liturgical season and the day of the week. Place yourself now in a Benedictine monastery in southern Germany in the year 1095. You're a relatively new monk, perhaps 2 years into your vows, and you're still adjusting to the rigorous schedule that governs every moment of your existence. The adjustment is harder than you expected, not because the work is too difficult or the food too meager, but because the schedule itself feels fundamentally unnatural. Consider your typical day. It begins not with the sunrise as you might expect, but hours before dawn. Around 2 a.m, a bell rings in the darkness. You wake from whatever sleep you've managed. Sleep is always broken, never deep, because you're sleeping in your habit on a straw mattress in a cold dormitory alongside 40 other monks. You rise, splash cold water on your face from a basin, and shuffle with your brothers through the darkness to the church for matins. Matins is the longest of the daily offices, sometimes lasting 2 hours. In the winter, when nights are longest, you stand or sit in the freezing church, chanting psalms while your breath makes clouds in the darkness. There are no fires in the church. The rule of Saint Benedict emphasizes enduring cold as a form of discipline. Your feet go numb, your hands grow stiff, but the schedule doesn't care about your comfort. The psalms must be chanted, the prayers must be said at this specific hour, regardless of how you feel. After matins, there's a brief return to the dormitory, but it's not really sleep, more like a nap. An hour or two of rest before the bell rings again for lauds at dawn. You're never fully rested. The schedule doesn't allow for complete sleep cycles. You exist in a state of perpetual mild exhaustion, always slightly foggy, never quite alert. Lauds greets the sunrise, and after lauds comes prime, and after prime comes breakfast, a simple meal of bread and perhaps some ale or watered wine. Then the day's work begins. But the work itself is constantly interrupted by the schedule. You might be assigned to the fields, planting or harvesting according to the season, but you can't simply work until the task is complete. Every 3 hours the bell rings for another office. Terce at mid-morning, sext at noon, none in mid-afternoon. Each time the bell rings, you must stop whatever you're doing, wash your hands if they're dirty, and proceed to the church to chant more psalms. This constant interruption fundamentally changes the nature of work. In the world outside the monastery, a farmer working his field can develop a rhythm, can lose himself in the task, can work until he's hungry or tired or until the light fails. You can't. Just as you're settling into the work, finding your rhythm, developing momentum, the bell rings. You must stop, transition to a completely different activity, prayer, and then return to work and try to regain the momentum you'd built. It's psychologically exhausting in a way that continuous hard labor might not be. The schedule also divorces activity from its natural purposes. You eat not when you're hungry, but when the schedule says it's time to eat. At the midday meal, after sext, you might not be particularly hungry yet. But you eat anyway because the schedule demands it, and you know that you won't eat again until evening. Conversely, during long afternoon work periods, you might become ravenously hungry hours before the evening meal. But there's no option to eat earlier. The schedule is inflexible. Similarly, you sleep not when you're tired, but when compline ends, around 8 or 9 in the evening. On summer evenings when the sun is still setting, when your body hasn't yet begun to feel drowsy, you nonetheless go to bed because that's what the schedule requires. And you wake not when you're rested, but when the bell rings for matins, pulling you from whatever depth of sleep you'd managed to reach. The effect of all this is profound and disorienting. Time stops being something you experience organically and becomes something imposed from outside, a series of obligations you must fulfill regardless of your body's needs or desires. Your natural circadian rhythms, the internal biological clock that regulates sleep and wakefulness, are constantly disrupted. Your hunger and satiety cues become unreliable guides because you're eating on a schedule rather than in response to physical need. But the schedule does more than just regulate activities. It creates a new kind of temporal awareness. In the monastery, you always know roughly what time it is because you know which office you've just attended or which is coming next. The day is divided not into hours, there are no clocks yet, not mechanical ones, but into liturgical segments. Time becomes liturgical time, measured by the rhythm of prayers rather than by the sun's position. This liturgical time has a peculiar quality. It's both utterly predictable and maddeningly repetitive. Every day follows the same pattern. Matins, lauds, prime, work, terce, work, sext, meal, work, none, work, vespers, supper, recreation, compline, sleep. Tomorrow will be identical, and the day after that, and the day after that. The specific psalms and readings might vary. There's a weekly cycle and a yearly cycle that provide some variation, but the basic structure never changes. This is where boredom, as a distinct psychological state, truly begins to emerge. In the world outside the monastery, life might be hard, dangerous, and unpredictable, but it's rarely boring. There's too much variation, too much uncertainty. You don't know if your crops will succeed or fail. You don't know if illness will strike. You don't know what tomorrow will bring. This uncertainty creates anxiety, but it also creates engagement. You're always responding to circumstances, always adapting. In the monastery, by contrast, you know exactly what tomorrow will bring, because tomorrow will be essentially identical to today. There are no surprises, no variations, no challenges to overcome, just the endless repetition of the same activities in the same order at the same times. This predictability, combined with the schedule's inflexibility, creates a state of mind that earlier humans rarely experienced. Profound, existential boredom. The Latin word for this state is acedia, often translated as sloth, but that translation misses something crucial. Acedia isn't simple laziness. It's a more complex state of spiritual and psychological torpor, a sense that nothing matters, that all activities are equally meaningless, that time is not passing, but merely recurring. The monk experiencing acedia fulfills his obligations, attends the offices, does his work, but mechanically, without engagement or meaning. He's going through the motions. While his inner life has gone numb, the Desert Fathers, the early Christian hermits who lived in Egypt in the 4th and 5th centuries, recognized acedia as a particular spiritual danger. They called it the noonday demon, because it often struck in the afternoon when the heat was most intense and the day seemed endless. The monk afflicted by acedia would feel overwhelmed by the pointlessness of his existence. What was the purpose of all this repetition? Why chant the same psalms day after day? Why endure this rigid schedule that allowed for no spontaneity, no freedom, no response to natural human needs? These questions trouble you during your 3rd year in the monastery. The initial excitement of your vocation has worn off. You've mastered the schedule. You know where you need to be and when. You've memorized most of the psalms. You can perform your duties competently. But this mastery brings no satisfaction, only a growing awareness of how monotonous your life has become. You notice acedia's effects in other monks as well. Brother Anselm, who works in the bakery, performs his tasks with mechanical precision but no apparent care or interest. He mixes dough, shapes loaves, and tends the ovens with the same expression throughout. Blank, distant, as if his mind is somewhere else entirely. Brother Otto, assigned to the gardens, moves slowly through his work, pausing frequently to stare at nothing in particular. When the bell rings for an office, he seems almost relieved, not because he's eager to pray, but because the bell provides a break from the tedious work. The schedule, paradoxically, both creates boredom and provides relief from it. The constant interruptions are maddening when you're trying to accomplish something, but they also prevent you from having to sustain focus on any single boring task for too long. If you had to spend 8 continuous hours in the bakery or the garden, the tedium might be unbearable. But because you only work for 2 or 3 hours before the bell rings for another office, each work period is just tolerable. The offices themselves, however, become boring in their own way. The first few months in the monastery, the liturgy seemed beautiful and meaningful. The Latin phrases, even when you didn't fully understand them, carried a sense of mystery and depth. The chanting created a meditative state that felt close to genuine prayer. But by your 3rd year, you've chanted these same psalms hundreds of times. The words have lost their novelty, their power to surprise or move you. They've become sounds you produce automatically while your mind wanders elsewhere. This mechanical performance of the liturgy is itself a form of acedia. You're doing what you're supposed to do, but without interior participation. Your body is in the choir stall, your voice is chanting the psalms, but your mind is thinking about the dinner you'll have in a few hours, or the slight you received from another monk yesterday, or simply wandering through random memories and fantasies. The schedule demands your physical presence and vocal participation, but it can't compel genuine attention or devotion. The older monks seem to handle this better, though it's hard to tell what's really going on in their interior lives. Brother Albrecht, who has been in the monastery for 40 years, chants the offices with the same steady, calm presence every time. Is he experiencing profound spiritual connection, or has he simply become so habituated to the routine that he performs it automatically? The way you breathe without thinking. You can't tell and there's no way to ask. The rule of silence prevents such conversations. And even during the monthly conversation walks, asking, "Are you bored by the liturgy?" seems too dangerous, too likely to be seen as a failure of faith. The question that haunts you, as you lie in your dormitory bed during the brief rest period between matins and lauds, is whether this boredom is a problem to be solved or a condition to be accepted. Is acedia a spiritual failing that you should fight against, striving to find fresh meaning in each repetition of the familiar prayers? Or is it an inevitable consequence of the schedule itself, something that every monk must simply endure as part of monastic discipline? The monastery's response to acedia is not to eliminate the schedule, that would be unthinkable, but to understand boredom itself as a spiritual discipline. This realization comes to you gradually through reading, conversation, and observation of how the experienced monks navigate the monotony. During one of the monthly conversation walks, you're paired with Brother Albrecht, the elderly monk whose steady participation in the liturgy you've admired and puzzled over. You gather your courage and ask him as delicately as you can whether he ever experiences the numbness that you feel during the offices, whether the endless repetition ever becomes meaningless to him. Brother Albrecht is quiet for a long moment, walking slowly along the cloister path. Then he says, "Every day, the boredom never stops." But that's not a failure. That's the point, he explains, his words coming slowly and carefully. The schedule, he says, is designed to strip away the reliance on feelings and novelty. In the world outside the monastery, people do what they feel like doing. They pray when they feel inspired to pray, work when they feel energetic, rest when they feel tired. Their spiritual life rises and falls with their emotions, which are as changeable as the weather. But the monk must learn to act independently of feeling, to pray when prayer feels dry and meaningless, to work when work feels pointless, to maintain the discipline regardless of interior state. The boredom, Brother Albrecht says, teaches you that your feelings don't matter. God doesn't need you to feel inspired. He needs you to be faithful. The schedule makes you faithful whether you want to be or not. That's its gift, not its flaw. This perspective is both troubling and liberating. Troubling because it seems to drain all spontaneity and joy from spiritual life, reducing it to mere mechanical obligation. But liberating because it removes the burden of having to generate appropriate feelings. You don't have to make yourself feel pious or devoted. You just have to show up, chant the psalms, do the work. The schedule carries you through the dry periods when inspiration fails. You begin to notice how the schedule creates a kind of autopilot mode that's actually useful during difficult times. When you're sick and illness is common in the cold, damp monastery, the schedule continues regardless. You still have to attend the offices if you're physically capable, still have to work if you can stand. This seems cruel, but it also prevents you from sinking into self-pity or dwelling on your discomfort. The schedule doesn't care how you feel. It keeps pulling you forward, making you act, preventing you from collapsing entirely. Similarly, when you're experiencing spiritual doubts, and you do, increasingly during your 4th and 5th years, the schedule prevents those doubts from paralyzing you. You don't have to resolve your theological questions before you pray. You just have to pray according to the schedule, and the prayers themselves sometimes gradually clarify the questions without you consciously working through them. The act of praying, even mechanical prayer, shapes your thinking in ways that purely intellectual analysis might not. But there's another dimension to the schedule that you begin to appreciate. It creates a shared experience that binds the community together. Every monk is experiencing the same boredom, the same struggle with acedia, the same challenge of maintaining discipline through endless repetition. When you look around the choir during none, the mid-afternoon office when energy is typically lowest and attention wanders most, you see 40 other men engaged in the same struggle. Brother Otto is yawning. Brother Anselm's eyes are closing. Brother Thomas is swaying slightly on his feet. But they're all there, all chanting the psalm, all maintaining the discipline. This shared struggle creates a form of solidarity that doesn't require words or even conscious acknowledgement. You're all in this together, all enduring the same monotonous schedule, all fighting the same battle against acedia. The very boredom becomes a kind of bond. The monastery also has practical strategies for managing the psychological effects of the rigid schedule. The work assignments rotate periodically. You might spend several months in the fields, then be reassigned to the scriptorium or the kitchen or the workshop. This rotation provides some variation, though not enough to eliminate boredom entirely. Each new assignment requires learning new skills, adapting to different rhythms, working with different brothers. Just as you're becoming completely numb to one form of labor, you're moved to something else. The liturgical year provides another layer of variation. The prayers and readings change according to the season: Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter, ordinary time. Each season has its own character, its own emphases, its own particular psalms and hymns. Lent is austere, stripped down, focused on penitence. Easter is exuberant, elaborate, focused on joy and resurrection. This yearly cycle prevents the liturgy from becoming completely static. Feast days punctuate the calendar with special observances. On major feasts, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, the schedule itself loosens slightly. The offices are longer and more elaborate, but there's also more recreation time, better food, a sense of celebration. On saints' days, special readings commemorate the particular saint. These variations are small, but in the context of overwhelming monotony, small variations matter enormously. You begin to live for these variations, these minor disruptions to the routine. A feast day becomes something to anticipate for weeks. The changing seasons, which you barely noticed in your life before the monastery, now carry profound significance. The first warm day of spring, when you can work in the fields without your fingers going numb, feels like a gift. The autumn harvest, when the food is more varied and abundant, becomes a highlight of the year. This heightened awareness of small pleasures is itself a product of the schedule. When every day is nearly identical, the smallest variation becomes noticeable and meaningful. A slightly better meal, a day with less work, an extra hour of recreation. These things that would be unremarkable in ordinary life become events, occasions for gratitude. The boredom, paradoxically, makes you more appreciative of the rare moments when boredom lifts. But the schedule also creates a strange relationship with time itself. In the outside world, time seems to pass at varying speeds depending on what you're doing. When you're engaged in interesting activity, time flies. When you're waiting or bored, time drags. But in the monastery, where most activities are equally boring, time takes on a peculiar uniformity. Hours feel like hours, days feel like days, with little subjective variation. This uniform experience of time has an odd effect. It seems both endless and fast simultaneously. On one hand, each day feels interminable while you're living through it. The afternoon work period between none and vespers, for instance, always seems to last forever. You check the sun's position repeatedly, calculating how much longer until the bell rings, and it always seems that more time remains than you hoped. But on the other hand, when you look back over weeks and months, they seem to have passed in a blur. You realize with shock that you've been in the monastery for 5 years, but the years don't feel distinct from each other. They've blended into an undifferentiated mass of repeated days. The older monks talk about this phenomenon. Brother Heinrich, who has been in the monastery for 35 years, says it feels like he entered just a few years ago. The decades have compressed in memory because there are so few distinctive events to mark their passage. When every day is the same, he says, Memory has nothing to hold on to. The years just disappear. This is both disturbing and oddly peaceful. The relentless forward march of time, which creates so much anxiety in the outside world, loses its urgency in the monastery. You're not building toward anything, not accumulating achievements or possessions, not progressing through life stages in the normal way. You're just continuing. Day after day, year after year, the same routine. There's no sense of time being wasted because there's no alternative use for the time. This is what you're doing with your life, this schedule, these offices, this work. There's nothing else. The schedule also affects your dreams and your sense of self. You begin to dream about the schedule. Anxiety dreams where you've missed an office and are rushing to the church, or where the bell is ringing but you can't get out of bed, or where the offices come one after another without pause and you're desperately tired but can't rest. These dreams reveal how deeply the schedule has penetrated your psyche, becoming part of the basic structure of your mental life. You also notice changes in your sense of identity. Before entering the monastery, you thought of yourself as a distinct individual with personal qualities, preferences, and characteristics. But the schedule doesn't care about your individuality. It treats all monks identically. The same wake-up time, the same offices, the same work assignments rotated fairly, the same meals. Over time, this uniform treatment begins to erode your sense of special individual identity. You're not Brother Friedrich, the unique person. You're just one monk among 40, indistinguishable in function and daily experience from any other. This ego dissolution is considered spiritually valuable in monastic tradition. The self, with all its preferences and pride and desires, is seen as an obstacle to union with God. The schedule, by grinding away at individual identity through sheer monotonous repetition, helps destroy the ego's grip. You become less attached to your preferences because the schedule doesn't accommodate them anyway. You become less proud because there's nothing to be proud of. You're just following the same routine everyone else follows. You become less driven by personal desire because desire itself becomes exhausted by the impossibility of its fulfillment. But this ego dissolution has costs. Some monks become almost zombie-like, going through the motions without any apparent interior life at all. Brother Conrad, a monk in his 50s, has a quality of complete blankness. He attends the offices, does his work, eats his meals, all with the same vacant expression. If he has thoughts or feelings, they're entirely invisible to observers. He's achieved perfect conformity to the schedule, but at what seems like the cost of his personality itself. You don't want to become Brother Conrad. You want to maintain some spark of interiority, some sense of yourself as a thinking, feeling person rather than a human machine executing a program. But you also recognize the appeal of his state. He never seems troubled by boredom or acedia. He never struggles with the schedule or resents its demands. He's achieved perfect equanimity through complete surrender to the routine. During your 6th year, the monastery receives a visit from the abbot of another Benedictine house, bringing several of his monks with him for a chapter meeting between the two communities. These visiting monks follow the same basic rule of Saint Benedict, but their particular customs differ slightly from yours. Their schedule includes one fewer office each day. They've combined prime and terce into a single service. They also allow more recreation time and have less elaborate liturgies. When you interact with these visitors during the shared meal and recreation period, you're struck by how different they seem from your own community. They're more animated, more conversational, more individually expressive. They haven't been ground down quite as thoroughly by their schedule. But when you mention this observation to Brother Albrecht, he points out that they also seem less disciplined, less focused, more scattered in their attention. Their easier schedule, he says, produces easier monks. But are they holier? I doubt it. This comment makes you think about what the schedule is really for. Is it about creating holiness, about bringing monks closer to God? Or is it about creating discipline and uniformity? About controlling and managing a community of men living in close quarters? The official answer is always the former. The schedule exists to structure prayer and work in a way that glorifies God and sanctifies the monks. But the practical effect seems more focused on the latter, preventing conflict, maintaining order, ensuring that everyone contributes their share to the community's work. Perhaps both purposes are real and intertwined. The schedule does create discipline and order, which are necessary for communal life. But that very discipline, maintained year after year through all the boredom and struggle, might also create something like holiness, not dramatic mystical experiences or profound spiritual insights, but a kind of patient, enduring faithfulness that has its own value. You think about the Desert Fathers again, those early hermits who lived alone in caves and huts, without schedules, without communities, without any external structure at all. They experienced terrible spiritual struggles, temptations, visions, demonic assaults, and yes, crushing boredom and acedia. But they faced these struggles alone, without the support of a structured schedule or a community following the same routine. The monastery offers something different, a collective approach to the spiritual life, where the schedule provides external structure that compensates for weakness of individual will. When your personal motivation fails, the schedule keeps you going. When you can't generate appropriate feelings, the schedule produces appropriate actions. When acedia makes everything seem meaningless, the schedule provides meaning through simple persistence. You continue because that's what you do, because that's what the schedule demands, because 40 other men are doing the same thing alongside you. But here's the question that won't leave you alone. Has the schedule become an end in itself rather than a means to something greater? Are you maintaining the routine because it serves some higher purpose, or simply because it's the routine? Because changing it would be unthinkable, because the boredom itself has become so familiar that you can't imagine life without it. The answer to that question comes not through philosophical insight but through disruption. In your 8th year at the monastery, an event occurs that breaks the schedule's tyranny and reveals both its power and its limitations. A fire starts in the kitchen during the preparation of the midday meal. No one is sure how it begins. Perhaps a spark from the hearth caught some dried herbs hanging from the rafters, or maybe a careless monk left a pot too close to the flames. However it starts, it spreads quickly. The kitchen, built of timber with a thatched roof, becomes an inferno within minutes. The bell rings, but not for an office. It's the alarm bell, a different tone, urgent and irregular. Monks pour out of the church, the scriptorium, the workshops, the fields. The schedule is instantly abandoned. There's no question of waiting for none or proceeding to the next appointed activity. Everyone converges on the kitchen with buckets, trying to contain the fire before it spreads to the adjoining buildings. You work for hours in a chaos, utterly unlike your normal existence. There's shouting, monks calling for more water, warning others away from collapsing timbers, coordinating the bucket chain. There's spontaneous decision-making. Brother Thomas sees the fire spreading toward the refectory and organizes a group to soak that building's walls with water. Brother Otto climbs onto the roof of the dormitory with several others to beat out embers that have blown across. No one asks permission. No one waits for instructions from the abbot. Everyone simply acts according to the immediate need. The fire is eventually contained, though the kitchen is completely destroyed and the refectory is heavily damaged. Miraculously, no one is seriously injured. When the immediate crisis passes, you all stand in the courtyard, filthy with soot and ash, exhausted and strangely exhilarated. You've just spent several hours engaged in urgent, meaningful activity, where your actions directly mattered. The contrast with the usual scheduled monotony is stunning. But then comes the question, what now? The regular schedule has been completely disrupted. You've missed none. The evening meal is impossible. There's no kitchen, no prepared food. The refectory is damaged and full of smoke. The normal routine cannot resume. For the first time since you entered the monastery, the schedule has been broken and no one quite knows what to do. The abbot calls an emergency chapter meeting. He's an older man, Abbot Wilhelm, who has led the monastery for 20 years and has never faced a crisis quite like this. He's visibly shaken, not just by the fire itself but by the schedule's disruption. "We will maintain our discipline," he says firmly. "The offices will continue. We will pray Vespers as scheduled and Compline after that. For tonight's meal we will eat bread and water in the cloister, since the refectory is unusable. Tomorrow we will begin repairs." And so the schedule reasserts itself, though in altered form. You pray Vespers in the church as always, though you're still dirty and exhausted and the smoke smell clings to everyone. You eat a simple meal sitting on the cloister benches rather than in the refectory. You sleep in the dormitory as usual, though the acrid smell of smoke pervades everything. The next days and weeks reveal something fascinating about the schedule's role in monastic life. The fire has created enormous practical problems that require creative, flexible solutions. Meals must be prepared without a proper kitchen. A temporary outdoor cooking area is set up. The refectory must be repaired while remaining partially usable. The work of rebuilding the kitchen must be organized, requiring skills and labor beyond the monastery's usual capacity, so craftsmen from the nearby town are hired. All of this requires constant adaptation, discussion, and decision-making, activities that don't fit neatly into the rigid schedule. And yet Abbot Wilhelm insists that the offices continue at their appointed times without exception. Even when monks are in the middle of critical repair work, when they're covered in plaster dust or carrying heavy timbers, the bell rings and they must stop, clean themselves minimally, and attend the office. This insistence seems almost absurd at first. Surely during a crisis, practical needs should take precedence over liturgical precision, but gradually you begin to understand the abbot's wisdom. The schedule, maintained even through disruption, provides psychological stability. Everything else has changed. The kitchen is gone, meals are different, work routines are altered, strangers are present, but the offices continue unchanged. This continuity creates an anchor, a fixed point in the chaos. You discover that you're actually grateful for this anchor. The flexibility required by the crisis is exhausting in its own way. After years of the schedule making all decisions for you, suddenly having to think, adapt, and choose is mentally draining. The offices, continuing on schedule, provide regular breaks from this flexibility. Moments when you return to the familiar routine and let it carry you. The visiting craftsmen provide another revelation. These are men from the town, working for wages, and they find the monastic schedule baffling and frustrating. They arrive at dawn ready to work, but after an hour the bell rings for prime and all the monks disappear into the church for 30 minutes. The craftsmen wait, idle, work resumes, but then terse interrupts it again. At noon, sext. In mid-afternoon, none. The craftsmen complain to Abbot Wilhelm that the constant interruptions make efficient work impossible. The abbot is unmoved. "We are not here to work efficiently," he tells them. "We are here to pray. The work serves the prayer, not the other way around." The craftsmen shake their heads, clearly thinking the monks are mad, but they adjust to the schedule because they need the work. Watching this interaction, you see the monastic schedule from an outside perspective for the first time in years. To the craftsman it seems like arbitrary, self-imposed inefficiency. Why stop work every 3 hours to chant psalms? Why not pray once in the morning and once in the evening and work continuously in between? Their way would get the kitchen rebuilt faster, would waste less time, would be more rational by any practical standard. But you realize that practical and rational are values that matter in the outside world. where the goal is productivity and efficiency. In the monastery, those aren't the primary values. The goal is constant orientation toward God, regular return to prayer, refusal to let work or any other activity become all-consuming. The schedule enforces this orientation through sheer repetition, never allowing more than 3 hours to pass without calling monks back to prayer. The rebuilding process takes 3 months. During this time, life in the monastery has an unusual quality. The combination of schedule and flexibility, routine and adaptation. You're more tired than usual because the physical labor of rebuilding is harder than normal monastery work. You're also more mentally engaged because the work requires problem solving and coordination in ways that routine agricultural labor doesn't. And something interesting happens. The boredom lessens. Not completely, but noticeably. The offices are still the same offices. The psalms are still the same psalms, but they feel less oppressive because they're now interrupting engaging work rather than tedious routine. The contrast makes both the work and the prayer feel more meaningful. This experience leads you to a new understanding of acedia. The boredom you've struggled with isn't caused by the schedule itself, but by the combination of the rigid schedule and meaningless work. When the work matters, when you're rebuilding something essential, when you can see direct results of your labor, when there's variety and challenge, the schedule becomes bearable, even helpful. But when the work is itself tedious and pointless feeling, and the schedule makes it impossible to lose yourself in even that tedious work, acedia becomes overwhelming. The problem is that most monastery work falls into the latter category. Copying manuscripts is important in an abstract sense, but on a daily level it's just repetitive hand movements. Agricultural work produces necessary food, but the individual tasks, weeding, harvesting, threshing, are mind-numbing. Kitchen work, workshop tasks, cleaning, maintenance, all necessary, none engaging. The schedule interrupts these activities before they can become absorbing, but they're not absorbing anyway. So the interruption is just an exchange of one form of tedium for another. Once the kitchen is rebuilt and the refectory repaired, life returns to normal. The craftsmen leave, taking with them the disruption and variety their presence brought. The schedule reasserts its full dominance. And within weeks, you and all the other monks slip back into the familiar state of numb, enduring boredom. But you've learned something from the fire and its aftermath. The schedule isn't an unchangeable law of nature. It's a human creation, a tool designed for a purpose. That purpose, maintaining constant orientation toward God through regular prayer, is valid. But the specific implementation of the schedule, with its particular number and timing of offices, its rigid inflexibility, its refusal to acknowledge human needs or circumstances, is arbitrary. It could be different. Other monasteries have different schedules. The visiting abbot's community proved that. This realization is both liberating and dangerous. Liberating because it removes the sense that you're trapped in something inevitable. The boredom you experience isn't an unavoidable consequence of religious life, but a specific consequence of this particular schedule applied to this particular form of work. Dangerous because once you recognize the schedule's arbitrariness, its authority weakens. Why continue following it so rigidly if it's just one possible approach among many? You're not alone in these thoughts. During a conversation walk with Brother Thomas, he admits similar doubts. I understand the value of discipline, he says, but sometimes I think we've made an idol of the schedule itself. We serve the schedule rather than allowing it to serve us. He glances around nervously as he says this, aware that such thoughts border on disobedience. Abbot Wilhelm, whether through insight or coincidence, addresses this very issue during a chapter meeting several months after the fire. Some of you, he says, looking around at the assembled monks, may have found the recent disruption to our routine refreshing. You may have felt more alive during the crisis than you normally do. This is natural. Novelty stimulates the mind. Variety prevents stagnation. He pauses, letting this acknowledgement sink in, then continues. But the spiritual life cannot be built on novelty and stimulation. Those things fade. They're unreliable. The schedule, in contrast, is absolutely reliable. It doesn't depend on your feelings or circumstances. It continues whether you're inspired or bored, healthy or sick, young or old. That reliability is its virtue, not its flaw. The schedule, Abbot Wilhelm says, teaches you that you are not the center of your own existence. Your preferences don't matter. Your feelings don't matter. Your desire for variety and stimulation don't matter. What matters is faithfulness, showing up, doing the work, praying the prayers day after day, year after year, regardless of how you feel about it. This is not a failure of the spiritual life. It is the spiritual life, stripped of illusions. His words resonate with Brother Albrecht's explanation from years ago, but now you understand them at a deeper level. The boredom isn't something to be overcome or escaped. It's the point. It's the tool that crushes the ego's demand to be entertained, to find meaning and satisfaction in every moment, to be the hero of your own story. The schedule makes you a minor character in a much longer story, a single monk in a centuries-long chain of monks, all doing the same boring work in the same boring way. And yet, something in you still rebels. Is this really what God wants? Decades of bored compliance with an arbitrary schedule? Or is this what the monastery wants because it makes monks manageable, predictable, controllable? The question feels dangerous, almost heretical, but you can't stop asking it. Over the following years, as you age into your 30s and then your 40s, you develop a kind of peace with the schedule, without fully resolving the philosophical questions it raises. You accept the boredom as a permanent feature of your existence. You stop fighting it or trying to escape it. You just endure it, day after day, letting the years accumulate. You notice that the younger monks, novices, and recently professed brothers still struggle with acedia as you once did. They're restless, dissatisfied, constantly seeking meaning in the routine and failing to find it. You want to tell them that the struggle eventually becomes less intense, not because they'll find meaning, but because they'll stop expecting to. But you're not sure this message would be helpful, so you stay silent. The monastery's schedule, you finally realize, has succeeded in its deepest purpose. It hasn't made you holy in any dramatic sense. You haven't achieved mystical union with God or experienced profound spiritual insights, but it has made you patient. It has taught you to continue without reward, to show up without enthusiasm, to be faithful without feeling. These are modest virtues perhaps, but they're real. And the schedule has given you something else, something you didn't expect. A blueprint for enduring time itself. Most people outside the monastery are anxious about time. They feel it passing too quickly, fear they're wasting it, worry about what they haven't accomplished. You've spent decades watching time pass in measured, predictable increments, marked not by achievement or progress, but by simple continuation. The offices come and go, the seasons cycle, the years accumulate. You're not building toward anything except your own death, which will come when it comes, and then another monk will take your place in the choir, and the schedule will continue without you. There's a strange peace in this. You're not responsible for making your life meaningful. The schedule provides whatever meaning there is. The meaning of faithfulness, of continuation, of being part of something larger than yourself. It's not the meaning you once hoped for, but it's enough. It has to be enough because it's what you have. The invention of the schedule, this division of time into measured mandatory segments, has spread far beyond the monastery walls. You hear from traveling monks about mechanical clocks being developed in some monasteries, devices that can measure hours precisely without reference to the sun. You hear about town bells that ring to mark work hours, mimicking the monastery's liturgical bells. The schedule you've endured for decades is becoming the model for how all of society will eventually organize time. People in the future will live their entire lives by schedules, work schedules, school schedules, transportation schedules. They'll experience time not as a natural flow but as a series of appointments and deadlines. They'll know the peculiar psychological state of waiting for a clock to reach a specific moment, of enduring present tedium for the sake of a scheduled future event. They'll understand acedia, though they'll call it something else. Burnout, depression, existential emptiness. The monastery hasn't just created a way to organize religious life. It's created a template for modern existence with all its productivity and all its profound, relentless boredom. You've been living in the future all along, enduring a form of time discipline that will eventually dominate human experience. Whether this is progress or tragedy, you can't say. You just know that when the bell rings for Vespers in a few minutes, you'll stop whatever you're thinking, proceed to the church and chant the psalms you've chanted thousands of times before. Because that's what the schedule requires. Because that's what you do. Because there's nothing else.